In today's video, we will be looking into the crucifixion torture. Crucifixion was a form of execution in which the victim's hands and feet were nailed to a cross. It was one of the most painful and disgraceful methods of capital punishment ever performed. In ancient times, crucifixion was one of the most brutal and shameful modes of execution. It was originally established in 6th century BC and began to be used systematically by the Persians. Alexander brought it to the eastern Mediterranean for the first time in the 4th century BC. It was virtually never used by the early Greeks. The Romans perfected crucifixion for 500 years, until the time it was abolished by Constantine I. Crucifixion in Roman times was applied mostly to slaves, disgraced soldiers, Christians, and foreigners, only very rarely to Roman citizens. The Jewish historian Josephus, who witnessed live crucifixions during Titus's siege on Jerusalem, called it the most wretched of deaths. Victims were usually beaten and tortured by various means, and then forced to carry their own cross to the crucifixion site. Because of the long, drawn-out suffering and horrible manner of execution, it was viewed as the supreme penalty by the Romans. The big question is, what is the crime for it to be implemented? It was used for punishing enemies of the state and slaves. Originally granted to slaves, whereas the enactment was later extended to citizens of the lower classes. According to Roman law, if a slave kills his or her master, all of the owner's slaves would be executed. Both men and women were crucified. Some members of the Senate attempted to prevent the mass crucifixion of 400 slaves in retaliation to Lucius Pedanius Secundus's death because of the large number of women and children. But in the end, the convention prevailed and they were all executed. Although there's not conclusive evidence of female crucifixion, the most ancient image of a Roman crucifixion may show a crucified woman, whether real or imaginary. One of the only specifically female crucifixions we have identified was that of Ida, who was crucified by order of Tiberius. Why was it used? Crucifixion was most frequently used for political reformers, pirates, slaves, or people without civil rights. In 519 BC, Darius I, king of Persia, crucified 3,000 political opponents in Babylon. In 88 BC, Alexander Jannaeus, the Judean king and high priest, crucified 800 Pharisaic opponents. And about 32 AD, Pontius Pilate had Jesus of Nazareth put to death by crucifixion. Who used to use it? Crucifixion was practiced by the Phoenicians and Carthaginians, and then later quite extensively by the Romans. Only slaves, peasants, and the lowest of criminals were crucified, but rarely Roman citizens. Historical sources reveal the practice of crucifixion being used in many other cultures as well, including the Assyrians, the people of India, the Scythians, the Taurians, the Thracians, the Celts, the Germans, the Britons, and the Numidians. The Greeks and Macedonians adopted the practice most likely from the Persians. The Romans used torture by tying the victim to a platter. Sometimes victims of torture were secured to wooden scaffolding without any restraints, to be publicly humiliated and driven mad. Then he would either be released or executed. How does it feel to be executed in this process? Pre-crucifixion torture usually involved beatings and lashings, but could also include burning, racking, mutilation, and violence toward the victim's family. Plato, the Greek philosopher, described such torture. Quote, "A man is racked, mutilated, has his eyes burned out, and after having all sorts of great injuries inflicted on him, and having seen his wife and children suffer the like, is at last impaled or tarred and burned alive." End quote. Typically, the victim would then be forced to carry the scaffold poles to the place of execution. Executioners would simultaneously affix the victim and the crossbeam to a stump or post. Sometimes, before nailing the victim to the cross, a mixture of vinegar, gall, and myrrh was offered to alleviate some of the victim's suffering. Wooden planks were usually fastened to the vertical stake as a footrest or seat, allowing the victim to rest his weight and lift himself for a breath. thus prolonging suffering and delaying death for up to 3 days. Unsupported, the victim would hang entirely from nail-pierced wrists, severely restricting breathing and circulation. Suffocation and heart failure are common results of torture of this kind. At times, mercy was shown by breaking the victim's legs, causing death to come quickly. As a deterrent to crime, crucifixions were carried out in highly public places, with the criminal charges posted on the cross above the victim's head. After death, the body was usually left hanging on the cross. And now, let's talk about the crucifixion of Jesus. The Bible teaches that Jesus Christ was crucified on a Roman cross as the perfect atoning sacrifice for the sins of all mankind, thus making the crucifix or cross one of the central themes and defining symbols of Christianity. The crucifixion of Jesus occurred in 1st century Judea around the time of AD 30 and AD 33. Jesus' crucifixion is described in the 4 Gospels, attested to by other ancient sources, and is established as a historical event, confirmed by non-Christian sources. Jesus was captured, charged, and sentenced by Pontius Pilate, and was beaten and eventually crucified by the Romans. Jesus was stripped of his clothing and offered vinegar mixed with myrrh or gall. He was then hung between 2 convicted thieves, and according to the Gospel of Mark, died by the 9th hour of the day at around 3 p.m. During this time, the soldiers affixed a sign to the top of the cross stating, "Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews," which according to the Gospel of John, John 19:20, was written in 3 languages, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. They then divided his garments among themselves and cast lots for his seamless robe. According to the Gospel of John, after Jesus' death, one soldier pierced his side with a spear to be certain that he had died. Then blood and water gushed from the wound. The Bible describes 7 statements that Jesus made while he was on the cross, as well as several supernatural events that occurred. Collectively referred to as the Passion, Jesus' suffering and redemptive death by crucifixion are the central aspects of Christian theology concerning the doctrines of salvation and atonement. The Bible declares that on the 3rd day Jesus was resurrected from the dead by God and was seen by many witnesses, including his disciples, who became great influential preachers of the gospel and were even tortured to death for their faith. One of them being Peter, the apostle who was crucified upside down because of his faith in Christ. The reason why he was crucified upside down was because he did not feel worthy to die the same way that Jesus did, so he told them to crucify him upside down. What did you learn from this video? Please let us know your thoughts in the comments section below.